Elderly man sells newspapers to survive. When an executive recognizes his watch, the story takes an unexpected turn. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the bustling streets of New York City, an elderly man's struggle for survival collides with corporate intrigue when a chance encounter brings two worlds crashing together. As a discarded timepiece becomes the key to unlocking a web of deceit, loyalties are tested, and the true cost of success is revealed in this gripping tale of redemption and justice. The biting winter wind whipped through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, carrying with it the acrid smell of exhaust and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts. Huddled against the bitter cold, 73-year-old Frank Holloway clutched a stack of newspapers to his chest, his gnarled fingers stiff and aching from the chill. The threadbare coat he wore offered little protection against the elements, a far cry from the bespoke suits that once graced his wardrobe. Extra, extra, read all about it. Frank's voice, once commanding boardrooms, now cracked as he called out to disinterested passers-by. Each ignored glance and quickened step past him was a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. Just 5 years ago, he had been Franklin J. Holloway, CEO of Holloway Industries, a Fortune 500 company that he had built from the ground up over 4 decades. Now, he was just Frank, the old man on the corner of 42nd and Lexington, another faceless member of New York City's invisible army of the downtrodden. As he stamped his feet to keep warm, Frank's eyes drifted to the gleaming skyscraper that loomed over him, the very building that once bore his name, now rebranded under new ownership. A young woman approached, her heels clicking purposefully on the sidewalk. "How much?" she asked, fishing in her purse for change. $2, ma'am," Frank replied, a ghost of his old charm surfacing as he handed her the paper with a trembling hand. As she walked away, Frank's gaze fell upon the watch adorning his wrist, a Patek Philippe Calatrava, its face scratched and its band worn, but still ticking away the seconds with Swiss precision. It was the last vestige of his former life, a birthday gift from his late wife, Margaret. He had pawned everything else of value, but this he couldn't bear to part with. Across the street, in the warm confines of a sleek black town car, Thomas Reeves adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. At 38, he was the youngest COO in Holloway Industries history, now rebranded as Apex Innovations. He had clawed his way up from a lowly intern to Frank Holloway's personal assistant, and finally to this poised to take over as CEO within the year. As the car inched forward in the morning traffic, Thomas's eye was caught by the haggard figure on the corner. There was something familiar about the old man's stance, the way he held himself despite his circumstances. Thomas leaned forward, squinting through the tinted windows. "Stop the car," he ordered the driver suddenly, his voice sharp with surprise. The driver obliged, pulling over to the curb. Thomas stepped out, his polished Oxfords crunching on the salt-strewn sidewalk. He approached Frank, who was in the middle of a transaction with another customer. "Mr. Holloway?" Thomas's voice was tinged with disbelief. Frank turned, his roomy eyes widening in recognition. "Thomas? Thomas Reeves." For a moment, the two men stood frozen, the years and circumstances that separated them stretching like an unbridgeable chasm. Then Thomas's gaze fell to Frank's wrist, and he inhaled sharply. "That watch," he murmured, reaching out to touch it before catching himself. "I remember the day Mrs. Holloway gave it to you, your 60th birthday." Frank instinctively covered the watch with his other hand, a flicker of his old pride surfacing. "Yes, well, it's seen better days, as have I." Thomas glanced around, suddenly aware of the curious stares from passers-by. "Mr. Holloway, I had no idea. What happened? The last I heard, you had retired to Florida." A bitter laugh escaped Frank's cracked lips. "Retired? Is that the story they're telling now?" He shook his head, years of pent-up anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "No, Thomas. I was forced out, framed. Everything I built, everything I worked for, gone in the blink of an eye." Thomas's brow furrowed, genuine confusion evident on his face. "Framed? But the evidence, the board said. The board lied, Frank hissed, leaning in close. And deep down, you know it. You were there, Thomas. You saw everything. A flicker of something, guilt, fear, passed across Thomas's features. He opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the insistent honking of his driver. I have to go, Thomas stammered, backing away. I'm late for a meeting, but Mr. Holloway, please take my card. We should talk. He pressed a sleek business card into Frank's weathered hand before hurrying back to his waiting car. As the town car pulled away, melting into the sea of traffic, Frank stared at the embossed lettering on the card. Thomas Reeves, Chief Operating Officer, Apex Innovations. Frank's fingers tightened around the card, crumpling its edges. For the first time in years, a spark ignited in his tired eyes, a dangerous mixture of hope and vengeance that would set in motion a chain of events neither man could have foreseen. The opulent corner office on the 52nd floor of Apex Innovations headquarters buzzed with nervous energy. Thomas Reeves paced back and forth, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, tie loosened and a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. The morning's encounter with Frank Holloway had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He knows, Thomas muttered to himself, running a hand through his meticulously styled hair. After all these years, he still knows. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Come in, he called, quickly composing himself. Ethan Parker, Apex's head of security, entered the room. At 6'4" with shoulders like a linebacker, Ethan cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit. You wanted to see me, sir? Thomas nodded, gesturing for Ethan to take a seat. Close the door, please. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Ethan complied, his face a mask of professional neutrality as he settled into one of the plush leather chairs facing Thomas's desk. Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself. I saw Frank Holloway this morning. Ethan's eyebrows shot up, the only indication of his surprise. Frank Holloway? The former CEO? I thought he was in Florida, enjoying his retirement. Thomas laughed bitterly. That's what we all thought. That's what we were told to think. But no, Ethan. Frank Holloway is here in New York, selling newspapers on a street corner like some common vagrant. Ethan leaned forward, his interest piqued. And this is a problem because? Thomas's pacing resumed, his agitation palpable. Because he remembers, Ethan. He knows what really happened 5 years ago. And if he starts talking, I thought all of that was handled. Ethan interjected, his tone carefully neutral. The evidence, the board's decision, the media coverage, it was airtight. Thomas stopped at the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city sprawled before him. It was, or at least we thought it was. But seeing him today, hearing him speak about being framed, I'm not so sure anymore. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft hum of the building's state-of-the-art climate control system. Ethan watched Thomas carefully, his mind working through the implications. What do you want me to do? He finally asked. Thomas turned back to face him, his expression grim. I need you to find out everything you can about Frank's life for the past 5 years. Where he's been, who he's talked to, what he knows. And most importantly, I need to know if he's been in contact with anyone who could cause problems for us. Ethan nodded slowly. Consider it done. But sir, if I may, why not just ignore him? He's a washed-up old man selling papers on the street. Who's going to believe him over you? The golden boy of Wall Street. A sardonic smile twisted Thomas's lips. You didn't know Frank in his prime, Ethan. The man built an empire from nothing. He has friends in high places even now. And that watch he's wearing is not just a timepiece. It's a key to something much bigger. Ethan's eyes narrowed. A key? To what? Thomas shook his head. I'm not entirely sure, but I remember overhearing a conversation between Frank and Margaret years ago. Something about the watch being more than it seemed, about it protecting their legacy. At the time, I thought it was just the sentimental ramblings of an old married couple. Now I'm not so sure. He moved back to his desk, sinking into his chair with a weary sigh. We need to tread carefully, Ethan. Very carefully. If there's even a shred of evidence out there that could exonerate Frank and implicate us, well, let's just say our comfortable lives here at Apex would come to a very abrupt and unpleasant end. Ethan stood, straightening his jacket. I understand, sir. I'll get my team on it right away. Discreetly, of course. As Ethan turned to leave, Thomas called out, One more thing. I want you to arrange a meeting with Frank. Somewhere private. Somewhere we can talk. The security chief paused at the door, a questioning look on his face. Are you sure that's wise? Thomas's eyes hardened, a glimpse of the ruthless ambition that had propelled him to his current position shining through. No, it's not wise, but it's necessary. I need to know what he knows, what he wants, and if it comes down to it, I need to remind him of exactly what he has to lose by pursuing this further. Ethan nodded once more, understanding the unspoken implication in Thomas's words. As he left the office, closing the door softly behind him, Thomas turned back to the window, his reflection superimposed over the New York skyline. For a moment, he saw not the polished executive he had become, but the eager young assistant he had once been, standing in awe of Frank Holloway's vision and leadership. He remembered the day he had made the choice that set him on this path, the day he had decided that ambition trumped loyalty, that power was worth any price. As the memory faded, Thomas straightened his tie and squared his shoulders. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to let one old man with a mysterious watch undo everything. Whatever Frank Holloway knew, whatever secrets that watch held, Thomas was determined to ensure they remained buried. Little did he know that across the city, in a tiny, cluttered apartment, Frank Holloway was setting in motion a plan of his own, a plan that would shake the foundations of Apex Innovations and force Thomas to confront the true cost of his ambition. The flickering fluorescent light in Frank's cramped studio apartment cast long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Seated at a rickety table, his arthritic fingers carefully turned the pages of a worn leather-bound journal. The book had been hidden for years, tucked away in a safety deposit box, the last remnant of his former life that the authorities hadn't seized. It's all here, Margaret, Frank murmured to the faded photograph of his late wife propped against an empty coffee mug. Everything we worked for, everything we built. It wasn't for nothing. He glanced at the Patek Philippe on his wrist, its steady ticking a comforting reminder of more prosperous times. Frank allowed himself a small, grim smile. Thomas had recognized the watch, just as he'd hoped. The bait was set. Now it was time to reel him in. A soft knock at the door startled Frank from his reverie. He quickly closed the journal, sliding it beneath a stack of newspapers. "Who is it?" he called, his voice gruff with suspicion. "Mr. Holloway? It's me, Emily. From 3B. Frank relaxed slightly, shuffling to the door and opening it to reveal a young woman in her early 20s. Her bright eyes a stark contrast to the dingy hallway behind her. "I brought you some soup," Emily said, holding up a steaming container. "I made too much and I thought you might like some." Frank's stern expression softened. "That's very kind of you, Emily. Please, come in." As Emily entered, her eyes widened at the sight of the stacks of newspapers and old financial reports that cluttered every surface. "Wow, Mr. Holloway, are you working on something?" Frank chuckled, a sound like rusty gears turning. "You could say that. Let's just call it a retirement project." Emily set the soup down on a clear spot on the table, her gaze falling on the photograph of Margaret. "Is this your wife? She's beautiful." "Was," Frank corrected gently. "She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." "I'm so sorry," Emily said, genuine sympathy in her voice. "It must be hard being alone." Frank's eyes misted over for a moment before he shook his head, as if clearing away cobwebs of memory. "It is, but I'm not alone, not really. I have my work and kind neighbors like you." Emily smiled, but her expression turned serious as she noticed the business card on the table, Thomas Reeves' card. "Mr. Holloway, I don't mean to pry, but is everything okay?" I saw a man in a fancy suit talking to you on your corner the other day. He seemed intense. Frank considered the young woman for a moment. In another life, Emily could have been his granddaughter. In this one, she was perhaps the closest thing he had to a friend. He made a decision. Emily, sit down. There's something I need to tell you. Something important. As Frank began to speak, unraveling the tale of corporate intrigue and betrayal that had led him to this tiny apartment, Emily listened with rapt attention. Outside, the city continued its ceaseless rhythm, unaware of the storm that was brewing in the heart of one of its forgotten citizens. Across town, in a dimly lit bar far removed from the glittering skyscrapers of Midtown, Ethan Parker nursed a whiskey neat. His phone buzzed insistently on the bar top. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Parker," he answered gruffly. The voice on the other end was terse, professional. "Sir, we've got a situation. The old man's been talking." Ethan's grip tightened on the glass. "To who?" "A young woman. Lives in his building. We've got audio, but it's patchy." Ethan downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp. "Keep monitoring. I want to know every word that comes out of Holloway's mouth. And find out everything you can about this woman." As he ended the call, Ethan's gaze fell on his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The face that stared back at him was harder than he remembered, etched with lines of stress and secrets kept too long. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" he muttered to himself, signaling the bartender for another drink. Little did Ethan know, the web of deceit he had helped weave was about to tighten around them all, drawing Frank, Thomas, Emily, and himself into a dangerous game where the stakes were higher than any of them could have imagined. The private dining room at Le Bernardin hummed with quiet luxury, a stark contrast to the bustling kitchen just beyond its oak-paneled walls. Thomas Reeves sat alone at the long table, absently swirling a glass of Bordeaux as he checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. The door opened, and Ethan entered, followed closely by a decidedly uncomfortable-looking Frank Holloway. The old man's threadbare coat and worn shoes seemed almost obscene in the opulent surroundings. "Mr. Holloway," Thomas stood, extending his hand with a practiced smile. "Thank you for joining us." Frank ignored the outstretched hand, fixing Thomas with a steely gaze as he lowered himself into a chair. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Thomas. We both know why we're here." Thomas's smile faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. He gestured to Ethan, who took up a position by the door, a silent sentinel. "Of course, straight to business as always. Some things never change, do they?" "Some things do," Frank retorted, his voice low and dangerous, like loyal employees turning into corporate vultures. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Thomas leaned forward, his facade of politeness slipping. "Be careful, Frank. You're treading on thin ice." "Am I?" Frank's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "I rather thought I was standing on solid ground. The ground of truth, to be precise." Thomas's knuckles whitened around his wine glass. "Truth? The truth is that you made some unfortunate investment decisions that cost the company millions. The board had no choice but to ask for your resignation." Frank's laugh was hollow, devoid of mirth. "Is that the story you tell yourself at night, Thomas? To help you sleep? We both know what really happened. The falsified reports, the offshore accounts, the whisper campaign to turn the board against me. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out?" For a moment, Thomas's carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing a flicker of fear. He quickly recovered, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "And what exactly do you think you can do about it, Frank? You're a washed-up old man selling newspapers on a street corner. Who would believe you over me?" Frank's hand moved to his wrist, fingers brushing over the face of his watch. "It's not about who would believe me, Thomas. It's about what I can prove." Thomas's eyes narrowed, focusing on the timepiece. "The watch. What is it? What does it do?" A small, triumphant smile played at the corners of Frank's mouth. "Wouldn't you like to know?" The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Ethan shifted uncomfortably by the door, his hand instinctively moving towards the concealed weapon at his hip. Thomas took a deep breath, visibly trying to regain control of the situation. Frank, be reasonable. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you can prove, it's not worth pursuing. Think about your life now, your circumstances. We could change all that, set you up somewhere nice, comfortable. All you have to do is let this go. For a long moment, Frank said nothing, his gaze moving from Thomas to Ethan and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You know, Thomas, when I first hired you, I saw something in you. Ambition, yes, but also integrity. I thought you could be the son Margaret and I never had. Someone to carry on our legacy. He shook his head sadly. I see now how wrong I was. You're nothing but a thief, Thomas. A thief who stole not just a company, but a dream. A vision for what business could be, should be. Frank stood, his movements slow but deliberate. I don't want your blood money. What I want is justice. And mark my words, I will have it. As he turned to leave, Thomas called out, desperation creeping into his voice. Frank, wait. You can't just walk away. You have no idea what you're dealing with. What's at stake? Frank paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. Oh, I think I do, Thomas. The question is, do you? With that, he was gone, leaving Thomas and Ethan staring at each other in stunned silence. Outside, as Frank made his way down the busy street, he allowed himself a small smile. The first move had been made, the pieces set in motion. He patted his pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of the tiny recorder he'd smuggled into the meeting. Check, he murmured to himself, disappearing into the crowd of oblivious New Yorkers. Back in the private dining room, Thomas slumped in his chair, the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. Ethan, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need you to find out everything there is to know about that watch, and I mean everything. Ethan nodded grimly. And Holloway? Thomas's eyes hardened, all traces of the charming executive vanishing. Do whatever it takes to neutralize this threat, whatever it takes. As Ethan left to carry out his orders, Thomas remained at the table, staring into his wine glass as if it held the answers to his mounting problems. The game had changed, and for the first time in years, he felt the icy fingers of fear creeping up his spine. Little did he know, the true nature of Frank's retirement project was about to come to light, setting in motion a chain of events that would shake Apex Innovations to its very foundations. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Emily found Frank at his usual corner, newspapers tucked under his arm. She approached him, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Mr. Holloway, she said, handing him one of the cups. I did what you asked. I think I found something. Frank's eyes lit up, a spark of his old self shining through. Let's walk, he said, guiding her away from his usual spot. As they strolled through the awakening city, Emily spoke in hushed tones. I went through those old financial reports you gave me. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed a pattern. There were these small discrepancies, fractions of cents really being rounded off in thousands of transactions. Frank nodded, a grim smile on his face. The old salami slicing technique. Classic embezzlement tactic. Go on. Emily's voice quickened with excitement. Well, I traced where those fractions were going. It was like following breadcrumbs, Mr. Holloway. They led to a series of offshore accounts, all linked to shell companies. And guess whose name I found associated with those companies? Thomas Reeves, Frank said, his voice a low growl. Not just him, Emily continued. There were others. Board members, executives. It's like a whole network of corruption. Frank stopped walking, turning to face Emily. You've done well, my dear. Very well indeed. But I need you to understand something. What we're dealing with here, it's dangerous. These people, they won't hesitate to. His words were cut short by the screech of tires. A black SUV pulled up beside them, and before either could react, 2 men in suits jumped out, grabbing Frank and Emily. Hey, what are you doing? Emily screamed as she was shoved into the vehicle. Frank struggled against his captor, his old bones protesting. Emily, he shouted, watching helplessly as the young woman disappeared into the SUV. A familiar voice spoke from behind him. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Frank." Frank turned to see Ethan standing there, his face a mask of regret. "You don't have to do this, Ethan," Frank pleaded. "It's not too late to make things right." Ethan shook his head. "I'm afraid it is, Mr. Holloway. For all of us." With that, he nodded to the man restraining Frank, who roughly pushed the old man into a waiting car. As the vehicle sped away, a lone figure stepped out from the shadows of a nearby alley. The man pulled out a phone, dialing quickly. "It's done," he said into the receiver. They took the bait. Both of them. Across town, in the opulent office of Apex Innovations, Thomas Reeves ended the call, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Checkmate, old man," he muttered to himself, unaware that the game was far from over. The warehouse was cold and damp, the smell of rust and neglect hanging heavy in the air. Emily sat on a metal folding chair, her wrists bound behind her back, fear etched across her face. Across from her, Frank sat in a similar state, but his expression was one of calm determination. "Mr. Holloway," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "what's going on? Who are these people?" Before Frank could answer, the heavy metal door creaked open, and Thomas Reeves strode in, flanked by Ethan and two other men in suits. Frank, Thomas said, clucking his tongue in disapproval. "I gave you a chance to walk away. Why couldn't you just enjoy your retirement like a good old man?" Frank's eyes blazed with defiance. "Because some things are worth fighting for, Thomas. Something you've clearly forgotten." Thomas chuckled, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous space. "Fighting for? What exactly are you fighting for, Frank? A company that's more successful than ever under my leadership? A legacy that, let's face it, was already fading before I stepped in." He turned his attention to Emily, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "And you, my dear, you should have stayed out of this. Some stones are better left unturned." Emily straightened in her chair, summoning her courage. "The truth always comes out, Mr. Reeves. Always." Thomas's facade of amusement slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of anger. He composed himself quickly, turning back to Frank. "The truth? You want to talk about truth? Fine. Let's talk about that watch of yours, Frank. The one you've been so cagey about." Frank instinctively glanced at his wrist, only to find the Patek Philippe missing. Thomas held it up, dangling it from his fingers. "Quite a remarkable piece of engineering," he mused. "It took our team a while to figure it out, but we got there in the end. A hidden compartment containing a micro SD card. Clever, very clever." Frank's face paled. "Thomas, listen to me. You don't understand what you're dealing with. That information, it's not just about the company. It's Dash." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Thomas interrupted. "This little card contains everything. The real financials, the evidence of the embezzlement, the names of everyone involved. Your trump card, so to speak." He pocketed the watch, a triumphant smirk on his face. "But you miscalculated, Frank. Did you really think I wouldn't have a contingency plan? As we speak, a very convincing trail of evidence is being created, linking you to a massive fraud scheme. Poor old Frank Holloway, so bitter about losing his company that he decided to destroy it from the outside." Emily gasped. "You can't do that. It's not true." Thomas turned to her, his eyes cold. "My dear, in this world, truth is what we make it. And I'm afraid your involvement makes you an accessory. Such a shame. Bright young thing like you, whole life ahead of you, thrown away for a senile old man's vendetta." Frank struggled against his restraints, his voice rising. "Leave her out of this, Thomas. This is between you and me." Thomas laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Oh, Frank, it's so much bigger than that now. But don't worry, I'm not a monster. I'm going to give you a choice." He pulled out a document from his jacket. "This is a confession. Sign it, admit to everything, and the girl goes free. Refuse and, well, let's just say the East River is always hungry for secrets. The warehouse fell silent, the weight of the ultimatum hanging heavy in the air. Frank looked from the document to Emily, conflict clear on his face. "Don't do it, Mr. Holloway," Emily pleaded. "We can fight this. The truth dash. Sometimes the truth isn't enough," Frank said softly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of defeat. Thomas smiled, sensing victory. He handed Frank a pen. "A wise decision, old man. Sign and this all ends." Frank took the pen, his hand shaking slightly. He looked up at Thomas, years of pain and betrayal evident in his eyes. "You know, Thomas, there's something Margaret used to say. The measure of a man isn't in how high he climbs, but in how he treats those beneath him." Thomas rolled his eyes. "Spare me the platitudes, Frank. Just sign the damn dash." His words were cut short by a sudden commotion outside. The sound of shouting and running feet echoed through the warehouse. Ethan rushed to the door, gun drawn, but before he could reach it, it burst open. A flood of FBI agents poured in, weapons raised. "FBI! Everybody freeze!" Thomas stumbled back, shock and disbelief written across his face. "What? How dash?" From behind the agents stepped a familiar figure, the man who had made the phone call earlier. He smirked at Thomas's confusion. "Surprise, surprise." As the agents moved to secure the room, freeing Emily and Frank, the full magnitude of what had just transpired began to dawn on Thomas. He turned to Frank, his face a mask of fury and fear. You set this up? But how? The watch? The card?" Frank stood, rubbing his wrists where the restraints had been. He looked at Thomas with a mixture of sadness and triumph. "Oh, Thomas, did you really think I'd keep the real evidence in something as obvious as a watch? You taught me the value of misdirection. Remember?" He turned to the man who had revealed himself as an undercover agent. "Thank you, Agent Donovan. Your timing is impeccable." Agent Donovan nodded. "We've been building this case for months, Mr. Holloway. Your cooperation was the final piece we needed." As Thomas and his associates were led away in handcuffs, Emily turned to Frank, her eyes wide with amazement. "Mr. Holloway, I don't understand. How did you?" Frank smiled, for the first time in years feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. "It's a long story, my dear. One that I think is best told over a hot meal. What do you say we get out of here and find a decent diner? I have a feeling it's going to be a long night of explanations." As they walked out of the warehouse into the crisp night air, Frank looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city's light pollution. He thought of Margaret, of the company they had built together, of the legacy they had wanted to leave. "We did it, love," he whispered to the sky. "We set things right." And for the first time in 5 long years, Frank Holloway felt the stirrings of hope for the future. The diner buzzed with late-night activity, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the warehouse. Frank and Emily sat in a corner booth, steaming mugs of coffee before them. The events of the day had left them both exhausted but exhilarated. "I still can't believe it," Emily said, shaking her head in amazement. "All this time, you were working with the FBI?" Frank nodded, a wry smile on his face. "Not at first. When I was forced out of the company, I was angry, confused. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't prove it. That's when I started digging." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant with memory. "I found discrepancies, patterns that didn't add up, but I also realized I was in over my head. That's when I reached out to an old friend at the FBI. Agent Donovan?" Emily guessed. "His father and I went to college together," Frank confirmed. "When I presented what I'd found, they launched an investigation. But they needed more. They needed someone on the inside." Emily's eyes widened with understanding. "So you played the part of the bitter old man, selling newspapers, while quietly gathering evidence," Frank finished. "It wasn't easy. There were times I almost gave up, times I thought about taking Thomas's offer of a comfortable retirement. But then I'd think of Margaret, of the company we built, of all the people who depended on us. I couldn't let it go." Emily reached across the table, squeezing Frank's hand. "You're incredible, Mr. Holloway, but I still don't understand about the watch. Why go through all that if it wasn't the real evidence?" Frank chuckled, tapping his temple. "Misdirection, my dear. I knew Thomas would fixate on the watch. It was too obvious, too tempting. While he was busy trying to crack that, the real evidence was being compiled and verified by the FBI. And the recording from your meeting at Lou Bernardine? The final nail in the coffin." Frank nodded. Thomas incriminated himself, thinking he held all the cards. Classic hubris. They fell silent for a moment, the weight of the day's events settling over them. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft. "What happens now, Mr. Holloway?" Frank leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. Now we rebuild. The company will need new leadership, people who understand the value of integrity and vision. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." He looked at Emily, a twinkle in his eye. "You know, we could use someone with your skills, someone who can spot patterns, who isn't afraid to ask tough questions. What do you say? Ready for a career change?" Emily's face lit up with excitement. "Are you serious?" I'd be honored, Mr. Holloway." As they continued to talk, planning for the future, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from across the street. Agent Donovan smiled to himself before turning and disappearing into the night. His job was done, but he had a feeling this was just the beginning of a new chapter for Holloway Industries. The conference room of Holloway Industries buzzed with anticipation. Board members, executives, and key stakeholders filled the seats, all eyes fixed on the front of the room where Frank Holloway stood, looking more vital and energized than he had in years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank began, his voice strong and clear, "a year ago, our company stood on the brink of moral bankruptcy. Today, I'm proud to say we've not only recovered, but we're stronger than ever." He gestured to the large screen behind him, where graphs and charts displayed the company's remarkable turnaround. "Our profits are up, yes, but more importantly, our ethical standards are unimpeachable. We've implemented new oversight measures, increased transparency, and recommitted ourselves to the values that built this company in the first place." Frank paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "But I'm not here to dwell on the past. I'm here to talk about the future. And that future," he said, smiling broadly, "is in very capable hands." He turned, extending his arm towards Emily, who stood from her seat and joined him at the front. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Emily Chun, our new Chief Ethics Officer and my personal choice to lead Holloway Industries into its next chapter." The room erupted in applause as Emily stepped forward, her posture confident but her eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice steady. "And thank you all for this opportunity." As Emily launched into her presentation, outlining her vision for the company's future, Frank quietly slipped out of the room. He made his way to his old office, now Emily's, and stood by the window, looking out over the city. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Agent Donovan leaning against the doorframe. "Quite a protege you found there, Frank," Donovan said, nodding towards the conference room. Frank smiled. "She reminds me of myself at that age. The drive, the integrity, but smarter, I think, and certainly better suited for this new world." Donovan moved to stand beside Frank. "You know, when we started this operation, I never thought I'd see Holloway Industries bounce back like this." "You've done good, Frank." "We've done good," Frank corrected him. "None of this would have been possible without you and your team." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Donovan spoke again. "So what's next for Frank Holloway? Riding off into the sunset?" Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Not quite. I've got a few more fights left in me. There are other companies out there that need help getting back on the right track. Other Thomas Reeveses that need to be stopped." He turned to face Donovan, his expression serious. "What do you say? Ready to take on corporate America, one corrupt CEO at a time?" Donovan grinned, extending his hand. "I thought you'd never ask." As they shook hands, sealing their new partnership, the sound of applause drifted in from the conference room. Frank glanced back, seeing Emily through the glass, confidently fielding questions from the board. "You know," Frank said softly, more to himself than to Donovan, "Margaret would have loved her." He touched the Patek Philippe on his wrist, no longer a decoy, but a cherished reminder of the woman who had stood by his side through it all. For a moment, he could almost hear Margaret's voice, telling him how proud she was, how this was always the legacy they had wanted to leave. Frank squared his shoulders, feeling younger and more energized than he had in years. "Well," he said to Donovan, a mischievous glint in his eye, "shall we go make some corporate bigwigs very, very nervous?" As they walked out of the office together, Frank knew that this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. The watch on his wrist ticked steadily, marking not just the passage of time, but the rhythm of a life recommitted to justice, integrity, and the pursuit of a better world. In boardrooms across the city, a whisper began to spread. Frank Holloway was back in the game, and this time he wasn't just fighting for a company. He was fighting for the soul of corporate America itself. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.